Okay, let's talk a little bit about the causes of the Great Depression. The first cause we want to take a look at is the Treaty of Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles was a cause of the Great Depression primarily because of the war reparations that it made Germany pay. It made Germany pay $36 billion in war reparations, and this really hinders the German economy from recovering. In fact, it never recovers. Immediately after World War I, Germany sets up what's called the Weimar Republic, and it really struggles with the economic problems of paying off this debt and trying to rebuild the German economy. And it never successfully solves that riddle. So, here in the United States, we think of, the Great Depression as being the 1930s, but really when you look at Europe, especially Germany, it's really almost all of the 1920s. The German government, the Weimar Republic, struggles to deal with the economic situation. They experience what's called hyperinflation, which means the price of things are rising so fast that basically devalues your money. Your money becomes worthless. You'd have to bring in a whole wheelbarrow full of money to go to the grocery store, and so you really cease to be able to use money. You have no means of exchange of goods and services, and so your economy falters. And that's what happened in Germany. And that's really where the epicenter of the Great Depression is. We think of the Great Depression as a United States phenomenon. It's not. It's a global phenomenon that really has its roots in Europe and then spreads to other places around the world. So really, the very beginnings of the Great Depression take place over in Europe, and you see it as a result of the Treaty of Versailles that ended World War I. It's not the only way World War I helps to cause the Great Depression, but it's certainly one of the more notable. Another issue we're struggling with throughout the world is overproduction. We'd become so good at making stuff that we made more stuff than we could buy. And you really start to see that glut of consumer products by the late 1920s reflected in high business inventories. In other words, businesses were making all this stuff, but then they couldn't sell it. So it's sitting on these shelves. And so without being able to sell these things, they're not able to make money because they're not selling anything. And so this was a sign that we knew things were really struggling. When we'd had high business inventories for quite some time, it's called an economic indicator. And this was an indication that we were in trouble. And we were aware of this throughout the late 1920s. Another area where we really had a lot of product were our farms. We had these huge farm surpluses, very similar to the high business inventories. That meant farmers weren't able to sell their goods. In large part, we can trace this huge farm surplus back to World War I too. During World War I, especially the United States sets in and they artificially prop up the price of wheat in particular. We need lots of wheat to feed our armies. And so we want to produce more of it. So the United States government thinks, hey, if we want to make more wheat, set the price high and prop up the price, jack it up. And then the farmers are going to look at that and say, hey, yeah, I'll go ahead and buy and make more wheat. Worked like a charm. The farmers did. They went ahead and ramped up production, so much so, farmers were going out getting loans because they wanted the newest tractors so they could plant more wheat, and they were getting loans to buy more farm fields because they were making money hand over fist. They thought, hey, happy days are here. This is awesome. And so they have now all this debt, which we're going to get to in a little bit, easy credit. Those farmers probably shouldn't have gotten those loans. But they're thinking, hey, we're going to be able to sell wheat and we're going to be able to pay it off. And if wheat prices had remained high, that would have been true. The problem is World War I ends. And so what ends up happening, World War I ends, farmers keep producing a ton. Now there's not those armies to feed. You have this huge supply, not enough demand. Boom, no more price controls. Price goes down through the floor, and all of a sudden farmers are losing money left and right. So really, those price controls, those government interference in the economy really lead to the surpluses that the farmers experienced, especially in the United States during the 1920s. Again, we think of the Great Depression as the 1930s. For farmers, the rural America, that depression probably begins a good 4 or 5 years earlier, 1925, especially 1926, things start to go south. And so the depression really in rural America had been a much larger phenomenon for a long time. Certainly another big problem, and I just mentioned this a little bit with the farmers, they were getting loans they probably shouldn't have gotten. Our banking industry was really not being smart with how they loaned out money. In particular, one of the big problems was something called buying on margin. That had to do with the stock market, and we'll talk about the stock market more too in a little bit. But buying on margin basically was, you'd go in and you'd say, hey, I want to buy $1,000 of this stock, but I only got $500. And so you go to your bank or your broker, you say, hey, you loan me the $500, I'll go ahead and I'll buy this $1,000 worth of stock, and when I sell it and make a profit, I'll pay you back your $500 plus a percentage of my profit. So the banks are like, yeah, that's a good idea. And so they go ahead, they give the loan. The problem is, what if the stock doesn't go up? What if the stock goes down? Then you can't sell your stock and pay off the loan. And so when banks got caught with this, that was a big problem because now banks all of a sudden weren't able to go ahead and and supply their customers' needs because people weren't paying off their loans. The installment plan is another new way of buying products that comes about during the 1920s. All of a sudden, you could buy everything on credit. This was new. This wasn't possible really before. You could buy washing machines. You could buy cars. You could buy all kinds of electronic devices, radios, stuff like that. Stuff that hadn't been available before that people wanted, and you could buy it on credit. And so it wasn't just simply the banks making bad loans. We had credit up the wazoo all over the place. And again, I've already mentioned the farmers. They've gone out and gotten these loans, and then all of a sudden the price of wheat falls through the floor and they can't pay them back. And so our banks weren't very smart in how they went out and gave out loans. Those bad loans came back to bite them, and all of a sudden the banks go out of business. Now they can't pay off their loans to other banks because banks loan money to one another, and it becomes like a cascading effect where one bank closes, then all of a sudden another bank closes, and all of a sudden now there's nobody to loan money. Businesses can't operate without flexible lines of credit and loans, and businesses start to fail because the banks are failing, and it becomes one massive snowball effect. And so easy credit really is a big cause of the Great Depression. And as I said, buying on margin is one of the things that leads to the stock market crash in two ways, really. Buying on margin creates an artificial demand. And so all of a sudden the stock prices soar way up above what the companies were actually really worth. And so it was a bubble. Our stocks were overpriced because there was this huge demand created by all of the easy credit. And this becomes a problem. And eventually the market's going to correct itself. And that happens, actually it takes 2 days, October 28th, 1929 and October 29th, 1929. October 29th is the day that's really known as the start of the Great Depression. It's kind of the signal. It's called Black Tuesday. October 28th was a Monday. But between those 2 days, the stock market loses about 25% of its total value. Now, back in the day, that wasn't that much because the stock market was only at about 260 points. So you're not talking about that much in the way of how much it loses. If you look at it today, though, the stock market's up like 15,000. You're talking about the stock market dropping thousands of points in 2 days, and so it was absolutely massive drop for back in the day, and they lose billions of dollars over the span of a couple days, over the span of a couple weeks, as companies' values crash back down to where probably they should have been, even below where they should have been in the first place. And this really signals the beginning of the Great Depression for a lot of places around the world, not just the United States. Another underlying factor that really causes the Great Depression, or that people attribute to the Great Depression, is uneven distribution of wealth. The rich were getting richer, the poor were getting poorer. As evidence of that, the top 1% in 1929 earned about 23% of the total income. And the problem with that is, hey, when you have all the wealth concentrated in just a few people's hands, the bottom line is, no matter how much stuff you buy, one person can't buy as much stuff as 1,000 people. They just can't. Take, for example, shoes, right? The person who has the most shoes that I've ever heard of is Imelda Marcos. She had like 26,000 pairs of shoes. She was the wife of the dictator of the Philippines back in the 1980s. You think about it, any local high school, how many students are in there, and if the local high school has about 1,000 kids in it, and those kids each have, let's say the average is 7 pairs of shoes, well, okay, that's 7,000 pairs of shoes. Well, then you go ahead and you take into account that kid also has family members similar to that. Maybe the average family is a family of 4, and there's 1,000 of them in there. All of a sudden now you're up to 28,000 pairs of shoes, and that's just from one high school. Imagine a district that has 5, 6, 7 high schools, and how many shoes are there. One person, just a few people, can't keep up with that level of demand. And so what ends up happening is you don't have enough consumers. There's not enough people wanting to buy all the stuff. That goes back to overproduction. Now we have more stuff than we can buy, and you have a bunch of people who don't have money to buy stuff. You don't have enough consumers, and that's one of the problems, underlying problems that led to the Great Depression. Another cause of the Great Depression was unbalanced foreign trade. This comes through in the form of tariffs. And you could go, again, all the way back to World War I and nationalism. Countries were looking out after themselves here. And so all of a sudden their companies couldn't go ahead and sell stuff, couldn't go ahead and get markets. So to protect their companies, they erect tariffs. The United States does this too. It's called the Hawley-Smoot Tariff Act. It erects the largest tariff in our nation's history. And basically what it does is it closes off the United States to other goods from outside the United States. Well, countries see us doing this and they're like, fine, you don't want to buy our stuff? You know what? We don't want to buy your stuff either, bucko. And so they go ahead and they put up tariffs themselves. Well, now our companies, which were so efficient at making all of this stuff, didn't have a place to sell it. And again, leading to huge business inventories. Companies were losing money. All of a sudden they have to let people go because they're not making enough money. Boom, it's like this vicious circle, right? So tariffs and unbalanced foreign trade, another big cause of the Great Depression. Another one that you'll hear referred to as mechanization. Again, going back to this idea of overproduction. Industrial Revolution starts all the way back in the 1800s. We've been getting better and better at making stuff. We've been more efficient, which means things are cheaper, which people think, hey, that's awesome. Things are cheaper. Unfortunately, we don't need as many people to make it either. And so all of a sudden we start letting people go. And if this change happens too fast, those people can't retrain to find another job somewhere else. Boom, you have people unemployed. Now they can't afford to buy all this stuff, no matter how cheap it is, because they don't have a job. And so this, again, leads to the problem of overproduction. So even though the goods are made more cheaply, more efficiently, and everything like that, it's still one of the problems that goes ahead and leads us into the Great Depression. The last thing I want to talk a little bit about is the Dust Bowl. Now, the Dust Bowl is kind of weird because it really doesn't kick up until the mid-1930s. And so it's really not one of the underlying causes of the Great Depression, but it is one of the things that makes it really tough on farmers. Because now, not only have they been losing their farms and they weren't able to sell any crops because the crops weren't worth anything, now all of a sudden you throw into that one of the worst droughts that the United States has ever encountered, and it's absolutely devastating. It's primarily in Oklahoma and Kansas. It's the mid-1930s, and again, it just really hits and makes the Depression even worse than it already had been. And so the Dust Bowl, is it an underlying cause? No. Does it go ahead and add to the problem with the farmers? Yes, it does. So it kind of like adds insult to injury in the 1930s, but not so much one of the underlying causes, which is one of the reasons I saved it to last. It's not one of the big ones. But so those are some of the causes of the Great Depression.